Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Kip. Kip, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Please, for everyone out there listening who might not know who you are, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Kip Curtis. I am an associate professor of environmental history at Ohio State University. And I'm not sure what else to tell you at this point. I guess we'll start talking.
Maybe I should just ask, what are you particularly interested in?
Sure. Well, I've got a couple topics. One, I historically study mining from an environmental perspective, but I've also been working on a really cool new food system, developing urban agriculture in a sustainable way.
Okay, so developing agriculture in a sustainable way. How can you just give me like the basics, I would say? Because I mean, for anybody like myself that's in like a city or something, we're not going to really know the first two steps of that one.
Sure. Well, I hope 10 years from now, everybody will be looking at these things. So just big picture background, agriculture is one of our most challenging industries and problems in the contemporary world. It produces about 20% of our CO2 output. It erodes soil. It pollutes waterways. On the flip side, we all eat every day, right? So it's not something we can live without, which makes it what social scientists call a wicked problem. That is that we can identify the problems, but the solutions are complicated. So zero in on what I'm working on, which is in the realm of urban agriculture. Over the last 10, 15 years or so, there's been this enormous push, particularly in the United States, to move agriculture into the city, in part to try to address some of the food insecurity issues that exist, particularly in low-income food deserts in cities. And I've been studying it for about 10 years, did a big project down in Florida around 2009 that launched a project down there called the Edible Peace Patch Project, which was really about schoolyard gardens, keeping kids in school. And I started thinking and looking at urban agriculture broadly. And what I noticed was it was a bit of a hodgepodge effort. It was community gardens that were asking community groups to take on too many responsibilities, or it was in one or two individualized urban farmers who had a connection with a single restaurant, and they didn't want to see any other urban farmers there. And so I stepped back and said, well, can we do this in a way that's sustainable? And I mean that in two ways. One, that it's organic, that it reduces carbon footprints, that it keeps soils healthy, et cetera. But also, can it be economically sustainable? Can we create a model that will put dollars into urban farmers' pockets? And part of my interest there is achieving the social part of sustainability, which is often neglected. Often we think only about the environment, and so can we bring people into this who might need additional income in their households, who can also at the same time produce fresh, healthy food and help improve the environment. And so I came up with a concept called the microfarm. And so this was an effort to standardize urban farming and say, look, we can't just do hodgepodge and any size and everything fits all. Let's come up with something that's actually workable. We came up with a couple criteria for it. One was that it had to be small enough for an individual household or an individual farmer to work about 20, 25 hours a week, but large enough to bring an income of $30,000 to $35,000 a year, which is a really nice supplemental for a low-income household and not a bad income for a startup, somebody coming out of high school or just out of college. And but we also knew that a single microfarm on its own wasn't going to be able to do the job that we wanted of it. And so we conceived of a system of microfarms. So we did the math on this, and about 10 at first, who are collectively organized into a cooperative. And if they work together with the cooperative, they can upload the kind of more complicated ongoing tasks of marketing, of crop planning, of all of the things that a farmer often spends more time than they have to do. And then the farms themselves just follow a crop plan, grow the crops that are already sold, and move those through the system. And I was very fortunate about 3 years ago to receive a $1 million grant from the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and collected a bunch of partners both in the university and in the city of Mansfield, where I've piloted this project to build one. And so we've spent the last 3 years training. We trained a dozen farmers. We've built 10 microfarms. These farmers are owners of their own cooperative. It's called the Richland Grow Op. The cooperative does the work that we planned for it. It goes out and finds buyers. It figures out what's going to be sold the next year. It creates a crop plan, and the farmers grow what they're asked. And we were, through this grant, able to build the system and kind of figure out how it worked. So we had a couple of years where we weren't looking at much income because we were just working out how to get all the pieces to work. And the grant ended this past December, and the cooperative is now operating on its own, and they are now looking at an income of $250,000 this coming year, and they anticipate doubling it next year. So we've successfully launched the system. We've successfully modeled it. And I'm in the process of building another one of these in nearby Marion, Ohio, and in the early stages of getting one launched in Columbus as well. And so sustainable agriculture, these are all organic practices that my farmers are using, incredibly short supply chain, and a successful business that's starting to put some dollars into households that need it.
What do you have you gotten together with a social psychologist to try and understand, like, because this might be a weird kind of question, but my kind of issues I start seeing is there's a major time consumption that people feel like they're not being able to do enough with the time that they have in a day. And I feel like if you're going to ask someone to create their own food or make their own food and even if it is sustainable and affordable, people just go, I just don't have the time. And I think partially that comes with the fact that a lot of people don't really understand the full background of what it really takes. And necessarily, technology's gotten so good that it might not even be that difficult to be able to create your own little bit of food as well too, without having to lose a lot of time. I think people are very, very disconnected from their food as much as they check the ingredient label that's inside of it. And that is important. It's great to know that if you're consuming a horrible pesticide as well too, because corners can be cut. But if you're able to understand that growing it isn't going to be as time tasking as you think it is, maybe you'll have a lot more people that are interested in doing it.
Well, so yeah, let me answer that in a sort of long-winded way, which is my way. But most people don't want to grow food. A, B. So my own experience, I grew up on a sustainable farm in the 1970s. My parents went back to the land and they took me with them, and we grew our own food. We grew our own protein. We harvested wood from the forest for heat and hot water. And it was an enormous time commitment, an enormous amount of work. And we tried to do it all for ourselves on 20 acres. I'll be a little bit of a wet blanket here for anybody who thinks, oh, it'd be really cool to grow my own food. Well, think about how much food you eat in a week. Think about how much food you eat in a month. Think about how much food you eat in a year. You're not going to produce your diet on your own plot of land. You might be able to supplement some vegetables, et cetera. And that's part of the design of the system. We're not asking these growers to grow their own food. We're asking them to grow food for the market so that they have dollars in their pockets to go out and purchase the food that they choose. And that's, for any farmer who's a real farmer, that's what they're trying to do. The idea that we can fill all of our front yards with vegetables and somehow supplement the food supply, it's a really nice idea. It's certainly, I have no problems with people growing some of their own food, but if they're honest with themselves and they do a real budget of what their food consumption is, They are, as we all are, highly dependent on a globalized food system. And this is an effort to try to right size that, right? So your vegetables, your specialty products should not be purchased from more than 50 miles away. But in order to make that happen, you need farmers who are producing sufficient scale so that when you go into your supermarket, the produce aisle is full with vegetables. So my approach to thinking about the food system is not, well, everybody should go back to being, sustainable. I mean, it's not a viable it's not a viable plan. A. B, really, most people don't want to farm, and a lot of people grow a garden one year or the next year, and the truth is most people don't have to farm. So if you have about 5% of a city engaged in food production and real food production, so that you're going to the supermarket and you're seeing the vegetables that you like to see, they're grade A vegetables, you have enough specialty crops being produced to feed that entire city, to make up for its demand itself. And you're doing another thing, which is you're starting to create a kind of circular economy. That is, right now, when you go to the supermarket, your dollars here in Ohio, they're going out to Arizona, they're going out to California, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars a year. If we can capture those dollars locally, they go back into local pockets, and that goes back into the local economy. And when you start a circular economy, you get 2 to 3 times the economic impact as sending those dollars out the door. But there are some things in our food system which can't be scaled all the way down like that. And so when I think about the food system and its sustainability, the challenge is right sizing the components of it that really ought not be done on a national or a global scale, and recognizing that some of those components really need to be. If we want to have enough wheat, if we want to have enough corn, if we want to have enough beef. Some people aren't pro beef. I don't have a huge problem with it. I have a problem with industrialized beef. We need some larger scales to keep that food affordable. But for things like specialty crops, for things like milk and dairy, those ought to be local, and that ought to be dollars that are not leaving the local economy, but are staying and making that local economy much more robust.
Is this just a giant problem that the food industry, as much as it's had its upgrades in certain areas, it's been lagging in some others? Like, for instance, cookie cutter example would be we have out in the country where there's open fields is where we get our crops from. We've never really focused on building it up in cities. We've made cities for a reason where high population density is, because we figure, hey, we already got buildings everywhere. There's no farms. You might as well just keep stacking on top and on top and on top.
Right.
But we've stuck very religiously to just very, very few states that are main producers, with giant fields, that produce
Yeah.
a lot
Well,
of our
so
food.
for your corns and your wheats, you need large swaths of land to be able to grow on. And the reality of ecosystems is that some soils and climates are much better for that than others. And we have maximized that not only in the United States, but globally. As for urban food, that's a brand new phenomenon. I mean, really, food was pushed out of the city at the end of the 19th century, right? This is only 100 years. Food was traditionally grown in and near cities, your milk, your meat, as well as your vegetables. And to this day, in the developing world, urban agriculture is a real thing. It's a part of the urban economy, and there are millions of urban farmers who are growing in that context. It's only in the United States and the Western world where, when industrialization took hold, and in part it had to do with the intensive coal pollution that was accompanying industrialization, it made sense to us to push that production outside of the system. The climate, the environment is not in the same condition at this point, and many cities have thousands of acres of available land and rooftops, which can be converted to this production. So we have the space for it. What you often run into in the large cities are these, late 19th, early 20th century regulations that were based on banning food. You have the challenge of land real estate costs. So, is it affordable to put a farm in a particular city because it's so expensive to pay the lease on that land? And then you have just a hodgepodge of regulations that don't always prohibit, but sometimes constrain this type of work.
If you had like a city like New York, let's say if you took maybe 5% of that population wants to really likes farming and wants to grow their own kind of food for the whole entire city or something. The issues that I would only see is that if you designate a certain like maybe like a park area, you designate something and you close it up and you put like, make a greenhouse, I would say, or something like that to
Or
grow
high
food.
tunnels is what we use.
You would just have people that were around the age I am that would just want to break in there and steal stuff as well too.
Well, yeah, we hear that. I've heard that since I put my first schoolyard garden in a low income neighborhood in Florida, that, you can't protect these crops. People are going to do damage to them. I have never experienced that. There is something about food and food production. I mean, the cornfields are wide open. Why aren't you driving your four-wheeler through those? There's something in our relationship to food that seems to prevent that from happening. And there is a ton of urban agriculture taking place in New York. New York is one of the leading cities in terms of urban ag, and they have a number of significant projects, both rooftop and open land, in greenhouses under high tunnels and in open fields. And it's there's no noticeable problem with vandalism, with theft, etc. And so it's a hypothetical problem that hasn't realized itself in the spaces where this is happening, is what I would
Y-
say.
Is this getting more traction also because of the pandemic? I feel like the pandemic probably, I mean, a lot of people started their own home gardens.
Yeah, it's a huge boost. I mean, there was a big bump in the early, around 2008, 2009, which I attribute to Michelle Obama putting a garden in at the White House. And that just seemed to really excite people about the idea of growing food locally. And then, yes, COVID really pushed people to think about the supply chain, and, would walk into our supermarket and there'd be things missing. I think hamburger at one point, toilet paper, etc. And that's been a real boon for the project that I'm working on, in that a lot of people see this as a kind of COVID resistant, supply chain challenges resistant manner of producing food. And I think that's only going to grow. The other thing that we're starting to digitize, so the digital revolution has been great for us. If we can do some of the kinds of things like Amazon does on a local scale, people can go onto their phone and with an app order some food. We get the order through, we put that through in boxes. All of that lowers the cost. It creates a more efficient system for us. So there's a number of trends that I think are pushing us in this direction. And I'll tell you, I'm fighting against what is the biggest investment and where most of the capital is going in urban food, and that's in hydroponic warehouses with robots tending crops. And that's our future. I mean, there are huge production sites in Taiwan at this point, producing for China. And it's a trend that a lot of the capital is looking for here. My problem with that is it takes people out of food. And so you mentioned earlier, where we're alienated from our food supply. If robots are growing our food and one technician is operating that, we're even more alienated from our food. And hydroponics, I'm going to get some heck for this, I'm sure, but hydroponics is not a sustainable agricultural system. It has too many inputs. It's much more expensive in terms of the materials that need to go into it, even though you can get a good cost in the end with your robots involved in that. And I also believe there's something necessary about having a certain number of us humans involved in growing food. It keeps a deeper connection to the ecologies that sustain us, which a warehouse like that just simply won't do.
Do you, because I really like this idea. I'm not trying to poke holes in it, but
No, please do.
I
Yeah, yeah.
can't get over the fact of like we're just running at a different level right now when it comes to people are more than willing to give up the hard work just to let a machine do it for them, let businesses do it for them. See, the thing is, whenever you say anything about agriculture or farming, people go, "Well, that's our farmers. We do it for the farmers." It's like you're thinking of a person These aren't
Right.
people, these are businesses. And sadly,
Yes.
we've let these giant business corporations take over the whole entire industry of it. So when people say, like when you see an ad for like Pepperidge Farm, remembers, when you see a Pepperidge Farm thing, it's not the old man sitting on the thing riding a horse. It's a
No.
giant business that's getting a lot of money into their pockets. And here's where like when I was chatting with Bart, was when he started talking about insecticides. This
Hmm.
becomes an issue because you've created this monster machine that loves to eat money, and they're going to find ways to cut corners. And sadly, those cutting corners happen to hit the public. And when it hits the public, it's in our health. It comes to our food. If they're going to want to, okay, food production's gone up. That means they need to do better ways to get more food. Well, they don't have more land, so let's get a better chemical to make the food grow faster. That's where you start having your issues, and you start seeing this encroachment onto where it starts danger. Like you hear people like lawsuits all the time that happen with this type of stuff. So I mean, it's you don't have a bad idea at all. I love the idea. I just don't know if the public is headed towards that way because sadly we've been so disconnected from it for so long. And as much as there's probably the independent person that goes after it and really wants to research where their food's coming from and go see where it's done and work with it and maybe grow their own, just the general public, the way the world is running is off of go to your job, make money, pay your bills, and then people just want to watch Netflix. And I think there's a large amount of kids like myself, probably it'd be the younger generation that really wants to take initiative in trying to save the earth. But even when we talk about the climate change topic, I have talked to so many people that'll say water energy or solar energy or air energy or this. Everyone's knows the problem. Everyone can sit there and say different ways about how this thing's bad and that thing's bad and this thing's bad. But what's the answer? And no one knows. They all say it's their own personal one, but I can tell you from everybody else that they all can poke holes in each other. That's what I'm trying to
Yeah.
say is like you have one giant thing that's very, very important that you want to head towards. And I feel like people are more than willing to tweet about it, but they're not going to do anything actually about it. And that's where I don't want society to fall into, which is, I mean, not like I said, it's not really your problem or it's not your plan here. It's everything, just the way the world's going. It's in a very lazy manner. And I'm hoping this is a great idea. I'm hoping people will start taking initiative because I know once they start doing it and once this starts becoming like a mainstream thing, it'll become normal. And then we can get past that and go even farther and even farther into it. But we're getting more disconnected rather than getting more connected.
Yeah, I mean, I share a lot of your despair, but I am much more optimistic. And so my and I think I probably would have agreed with you 100% 10, 15 years ago. The world was going to hell in a hay basket. People were going online, getting more disconnected, etc. But for the past 10 years, I've been, instead of following Twitter, instead of feeling, instead of thinking that, well, globally this is too big, right? That's kind of what you're suggesting, like this is a trend that's just massive and overwhelming us. Asking myself, well, what can I do? And so I've been working in communities and I've been working with people, and I'll tell you, the 12 farmers who are now making money off of this in Mansfield, it sounds small, but you got to start somewhere, right? They consider themselves revolutionary pioneers in the food system, and they're going out and talking about this everywhere. That's where change starts, right? And I'm also privileged to be a tenured faculty member at Ohio State University. And while the rhetoric is very similar to your rhetoric, what I see in the engineering departments, what I see in the science departments, what I see in the political science departments is that everybody's on task for this. Everybody is thinking about sustainability. Everybody is thinking about how do we improve the conditions that have that and even change the conditions that have gotten us to this place. And I don't read about it on Twitter. When I go on Twitter, when I go on Twitter, I want to go out behind the shed and put a hammer through my head. It's a depressing place that cultivates depression and disdain. And so being in contact with people, working with people towards effective change. I work with students all the time as well. I'm exceptionally hopeful. I think So, when I started my career in 2001, I worked for a nonprofit called Second Nature. And our job was to try to convince the universities to take sustainability seriously. And I spent 2 years meeting with faculty and administrators, and nobody was taking it seriously at that point. Nobody was thinking about it. And we weren't the only organization doing this. But it felt like a real uphill slog. But we met with real people. We created real communities of practice inside of universities. We offered real plans that were starting points. 20 years later, Robbie, the universities around the United States have taken this seriously. And so part of it is how you approach understanding what change is and how change happens. And I have the benefit of 25 years in the academy to have seen tremendous change. I have the benefit of remembering the 1970s when we weren't even supposed to make it to the year 2000 with our resources. Like the sky was falling, it was falling hard. We needed to change everything fast or we were all going to lose. The rivers are cleaner than they were when I was a kid. The soils are healthier than we were when I was a kid. Our climate change problem is one of our biggest environmental problems, and along with it, the oceans and the overfishing of the oceans. But compared to the spate of environmental harms that were taking place on a daily basis, there has been significant change. And so it's a matter of your change horizon, and it's a matter of how you understand how social change takes place. So the kind of holy grail of the environmental movement, because of its legislative successes in the 1970s, is environmental laws and international agreements. And if you just look at environmental laws and international agreements, you have to be depressed. There's not a whole lot. There haven't been any environmental laws really since 1990 in the United States. And our international agreements are good, but they're not great. But if you understand social change is actually taking place on the individual cultural level, and you go and look at the places where culture is recreated, the university is a key institution for that. That's why I'm optimistic. The change is there. The problem is on everybody's radar, and the solutions are coming, and they're coming fast and furious. And so don't depend on Twitter. Go and visit an engineering department. Go and visit a science department. See how many young people are dedicating their lives to making this change grow from the ground up. And I, in that sense, I'm extremely hopeful. And that's where I put this microfarm project. Is I can't do everything, but if I can do something that ultimately can have a large effect over a course of 10 or 15 years, if I can transform urban agriculture into a sustainable, productive system that makes it possible for food dollars to flow into local households and produce food and do so organically, and by the way, produce a surplus that's not marketable that goes into food insecurity as well, then I've done something good, and I'm patient enough to make this happen over 5 or 10 years.
This can kind of get people hearing it will be labeled as a conspiracy, what I'm about to say. I don't think it is at all. I just wonder if the powers that be would let that happen. And what I mean by that is like big business. Big business doesn't want to give up its money, and what you're doing in your idea is not really. I would say it's taking money away from them a little bit. The giant corporations that kind of own the market, they don't want the world to get better. As many ads as they throw out there saying that they want the earth to be around forever, not really. They just want to make money. That's all. But it fits the narrative of the people. And I think people are starting to realize that and notice it, even though it can get labeled as like a conspiracy thing. I'm just hoping that they're not going to be like, okay, we see the narrative switching, and then they're going to want to get involved, and then they hijack it and completely throw us off track. Because I believe, it's just like with giant corporations. Like if anybody tried to buy this show, immediately as soon as they buy it, they go, well, I have some changes you could do. And it's like, no, then it loses my essence. It loses me.
Yeah,
If you're
yeah, yeah.
giving me a certain thing to run off of, that's exactly what this is. There are so many good ideas that I've heard of that have been bought by a giant corporation, and they've completely changed it. And this thing could have been something that could have changed history, could have changed the way the world's running. But it's hard not to think that the powers that be, which are these giant corporations, don't want it to shift. They obviously don't. They're making bank off of it, and this they don't want to lose money, even if it's a new idea. They want to just keep the money that they have or make more. And that's why this has been going on for so long. It's not a matter of the people not wanting this to happen. It's a matter of just people aren't connected to that part of it. They don't know this inner backdrop that's happening behind the curtain. And I'm hoping that your types of movements and also other people out there doing things like this are going to be able to show people that.
Well, let me ask you a question. Why do you do the podcast? If the world is that
Lonely.
corrupt.
Lonely.
But you don't do it for no reason, right? You assume that putting conversations out there will affect some kind of change. I mean, you're not doing this because you don't think you could make a difference. Am I right?
I mostly do it for selfish intent because I get to get your perspective on my. Well, it's conversation is the biggest tool that we have as people. Everyone's a little
Yes.
bit of code and everyone's a little bit of information, but you can gain insight from never shutting somebody out, but always listening and talking and having this energy exchange. You gain something from it.
Right, right. Well, so I don't buy the I don't buy the conspiracy that corporations are out there doing just evil, and I don't buy the perceived reality that there aren't actually human beings who are in there making decisions and are making complicated moral decisions. And I think that's more the case than not the case. Now, often part of that complicated moral decision is pushing a profit margin, is trying to get the most. But you and I eat well because these systems perform well, and we're not worried about famine in this country and haven't been worried about famine in this country because it's more than just profit that's at play there. It is producing food, it is producing things that people want because people buy them, and it is responsive to the market itself. It's not just a one-way street or just a one-way behemoth. That said, we I am very aware that if we get significant enough sales that we start to take a bite out of Cisco, that they're going to try to come after us. And my strategy is to create a robust enough system with a robust enough brand that will have some ability to weather that fight. And that's the reality of the market system. You have to compete. Sometimes people who have more power compete in dirty ways and get bad outcomes. But if you build something that is broad based, widely supported, it'll change. Nobody would have guessed in the 1970s that there'd be something like Whole Foods. Now it's been bought out by Amazon, and we can get into the downsides of that. But the emergence of Whole Foods in the first place, the emergence of that very idea, was a radical, marginal idea that nobody took seriously when my parents and I were growing in the 1970s. And so there is a continual pattern of change that we can't fully control, but if we can influence towards the values that we believe are most important, we can do better than if we throw up our hands and say, there's nothing we can do here.
What do you think about the idea of just places only having food that can grow there rather than having food that has to get exported out from somewhere else, like far away? Like pineapples, mostly there's a Dole plantation in Hawaii because it takes so long to grow a pineapple. But like if you have to sacrifice a pineapple all because of the amount of gas and all the amount of shipping and all that to get to your place, like I feel like especially in urban developments, if you can only grow this type of crop, you should only be growing that type of crop. I had a Peter Chesson on here who studies the coevolution theory. And he brought up he was speaking mostly about plants and plant diversity and all those types of things, but also people that are just choosing to have this type of flower or plant grow here because they like the way it looks and it messes up the whole natural ecosystem of the environment. People start liking the transplant plants over the actual natural ones, which messes up the whole ecosystem. And I start going, well, if you can't naturally grow a certain crop in your area, I don't necessarily want a device being able to do it for you because I feel like it messes up a piece of it. It's like genetically modifying, except you're just modifying kind of the area like humans kind of tend to do.
Yeah, we're in the midst of a world historic um, bio revolution, and it goes back to contact. It goes back to the 16th century, when several separate hearts of agriculture, one's in the Americas, one's in China, one's in the Philippines, one's in Europe, all came together and became what we think of as agriculture today. So, there were no tomatoes in Italy before the 1500s. There were no potatoes, there were no beans. And in the 20th century, we've seen, like you're describing here, this movement, this global movement of crops, and plants and horticulture across the globe. Um, there is no there is that's Pandora's box, which has been opened, and I don't think there's any going back from that. I don't think there's anything reasonable that we can do to stop that, because it's happened already. I don't necessarily think that we've messed up ecosystems. I think what we've done is change them radically. The thing I know about ecology is that ecology is insanely resilient. And so we're in a short time window of new things kind of moving into ecosystems and having a certain advantage. But what happens over time is a balance reestablishes itself. And we could, so I worked on a project in Florida, and I think this is a valuable project to go in with hand tools and remove invasive species from a natural area. And I chose that because the way that invasive species is removed in Florida traditionally is to use a pesticide, is to use an herbicide, which kills everything. And I said, well, there's got to be a better way to get at this. And the students that I worked with on that were able to understand the ecology of that plant and their own sort of relationship to it through the work that they did better than anything they studied in a textbook. And so I think projects like that, to try to create what you might call a historic ecosystem, are really valuable. But over the long run, I teach a class called Global Environmental History, and we start from the formation of the earth and we come to the present. And over the long stretch of ecological history, change is the norm, change isn't the exception. And so there's a little bit of a heightened sense of, oh well, this is something that's going to ruin everything. And I would say no, it's going to change everything. And nature is not at risk from us, although we may be at risk from our own behavior. But nature is going to continue to live on. And the nature that emerges should humans perish, which I don't see it happening, the nature that's going to live on over the next 100,000 years is going to be marked by this massive biological transformation that the global economy has beset on the world. And it's no different than the end of the Permian transition, when 90% of everything went extinct. Only it's happening at our hands, and so we have moral questions we have to ask about it. My approach is, though, is to not despair, one, that nature isn't anything but resilient. Two, to not despair that human beings are anything but responsive to the problems that beset them. And that's my experience in 50 years of the environmental movement. And three is to remind younger people that change happens on a variety of different scales. And so when you learn about all of the problems that are out there today, it's overwhelming. But the reason you know about all of the problems that are out there today is because an environmental movement in the 1970s said, we can't ignore this stuff. We have to pay attention to all of it. And we know more about the conditions of life on Earth today than we did even 20 years ago. And we know more about the potential futures that we're moving into than any humans have ever known in all of human history. So we're uniquely positioned to do something about it on all levels. And that's, again, where my hopefulness comes from. I don't deny the problems, but I think the solutions take place on multiple levels and are underway. And I think they're happening. I think my microfarm project is just one example of getting down to the roots, building something new that will spread everywhere and bring a different kind of economy.
I I still question people. Like, I know we have like more information than 20 years ago, or I just I think when you have people that are literally future tripping, I would say future worrying about things, they don't tend to think rationally about a lot of stuff.
I agree.
Even with like the climate change topic in general, there's a giant push that the world's going to die tomorrow. And it has a
Yeah, it's
lot of
not.
people acting very drastically about things. And I think it needs to be spoken of rationally. If you're talking about in the next 100 years, okay. But I get it. We're fourth quarter people. The human species is a fourth quarter thing. It's that type of thing where at the last minute, we're going to throw a touchdown pass and try. That's
Yes.
always how we've done, but I don't think that necessarily needs to be how it always needs to go. I think we need to start working on more sustainable things, but I think it needs to be done in a rational way. And you see a lot more fighting about the topic than you do of actual things being solved.
Not
And
in the engineering departments, not in the science
I'm talking about
department. Nobody's
general public,
Yeah, but what is the general public, right? Is it the Twitter feed, which is
the
excessively
world,
negative and
CNN, Tucker
pessimistic?
Carlson.
So is it legacy media, which is in the final throes of its existence because of things like this, right? So we are in a massive cultural transition. The powers that be are, so the political parties are as divided today because of this massive transition. In normal course of US history, this would be the time for a new party and a shift, and that shift is taking place on a cultural level, and the parties are holding on for dear life, and they're holding on for dear life by making the most extreme egregious claims, excuse me, about the other side. That is a symptom of this transition. It is not the cause of the transition. And I think that it's okay that we're fourth quarter people. If if we aren't, we lose, right? It's hard to make changes, but if you don't make changes, you lose. And so we're in a really interesting moment that I believe, and this is, I'm a historian, so I'm not supposed to prognosticate the future, um, but I believe by the end of the 2020s, this will have worked itself out, and it will have worked itself out in ways that we can't even imagine today. And the reason why I'm building a grassroots new food economy in urban centers is because I believe we need to have viable solutions as it works itself out. And somewhere down the road, everybody's going to see what a great idea it is, as much as the people in Mansfield and Marion are seeing it today. And I don't need the whole world to see it today. I need the system to prove itself so that as that shift takes place, people go, oh, right, that's a fantastic alternative. Why didn't we think of that before?
Yeah, I definitely think change starts small and then it builds its way up after a while. I honestly think it's the future generations that are going to be people that are going to, like, you see the younger generations coming up now, and I'm not that old. I'm only 24, but you're seeing younger generations that are coming up that are caring a lot more. I wish they wouldn't be so aggressive in their actions, but I understand their aggressiveness as well too, because they are being shown a lot of stuff that's been going on for so long, and they're trying to make drastic change right now. But I think when your brain's still developing like that, they're not showing them the fear narrative or showing them the blasting. They don't have thoughts that come through. They just have action. And that's when you lose critical thinking about some certain things, about what's a way we can develop this. And this leads to the topic I wanted to talk about as well too, which is the renewable energy thing. Now, I've talked to a lot of people, and now it's interesting you do something on mining as well too, because when we talk about the fossil fuel thing, now when I go and research about fossil fuels and I want to speak to someone who talks about fossil fuels, I don't like it at the bottom of their website when it says ExxonMobil or something like that that is sponsoring their website, because I go, well, you're immediately hooked in with the fossil fuel companies. I don't want to talk to you now because you might have a biased view, but I want to know about this renewable energy discussion that has been. I've talked to people who study the oceans. I've literally talked to everyone but from a mining thing, because that always leads to the topic of fracking endangering people's health. And I start wondering, am I just missing some key information from the other side that's involved in this? And I'm hoping maybe you can shed some light in on what you did with this as well too when it comes to working or writing books about mining. The industry and also renewable energy wise, that's, is it a viable option, is it not, could we, is this okay system that we're in? I know a lot of people have complaints on it, but we honestly have never been on anything new before. I bet you once water or whatever new renewable energy they put in, we're going to have a lot of complaints about that too. It's kind of like our presidents.
Right, right. So there's nothing that doesn't have a footprint. And that's the greatest challenge. We are, our economy is intimately tied to energy, and that's the way it works. Energy, it's a physical reality. It's physics itself. The Industrial Revolution was an energy revolution. It was a shift to coal and an unshackling from the organic economy. And unless we want to reshackle ourselves to an organic economy, which means retreating to something like the Middle Ages at best, which by all measures, short, miserable lives. We are hitched to a high energy production economy. Renewable energies have to be a part of that. There's just no question about it. Our use of fossil fuels has got to plateau and it's got to diminish. But renewables create a whole other set of problems. So you might have read that it's going to be much more expensive to get electric cars because of the war in Ukraine, because Ukraine produces a significant amount of nickel. Nickel is needed for batteries. Cobalt is needed for batteries. We can't make, there's no such thing as clean energy, right? Somewhere along the line, the materials that are necessary for that energy are going to come from the earth and are going to have to be extracted from the earth. And that process is by its very nature messy and dirty. I will say I went into my graduate work wanting to write a book that essentially condemned the mining industry because I could see how destructive it was. I was working up in Montana. The Berkeley pit in Butte, Montana is this massive gaping hole in the ground that was started in the 1950s to dig out the rest of the copper. The river itself had these occasional floodings of arsenic, which was a byproduct of the copper mining, which killed all of the fish. And so I was bound and determined to make an argument against mining. But I was a serious intellectual and I was a serious historian. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized that we've been mining forever. Like there's nothing new about mining at all. We've been mining since 3000 BC. It's been a core part of civilization for as long as civilization has been around. And it's been the ugly stepsister of civilization since civilization's been around. And so the question isn't whether or not we mine. The question is how and where and under what social conditions we mine. And because there's no escaping from it. So I don't see how we just immediately transform to a wind and solar economy and maintain our economy. Like people will starve. There isn't enough energy generated from where it's built up at this point to sustain the economy that we have. So there's always a necessity for fossil fuels. And so if you're going to do fossil fuels, well, coal is pretty polluting, no matter how much they try to scrub it and clean it. It puts a ton of CO2 out there. Oil is less polluting. Natural gas is significantly less polluting. And there's a ton of natural gas. And so I'm not averse to making a fossil fuel shift towards the least impactful fossil fuel, which would be your natural gas, while making a shift to as much renewable as we possibly can put in. Of course, the cleanest is going to be hydropower, but there's only certain places on the planet where it's there. Your solar and your wind requires battery storage because it's not a steady flow of electricity, which means the more batteries you have, the more minerals you're going to need to pull out of the ground in order to build those batteries and make that work. And so there needs to be in that process a very careful cost benefit analysis. Like, how do we make the shift to the cleanest energy that we can? And clean isn't just CO2 emissions, but that's a critical part of it. It's also, what are the environmental impacts of the kinds of mining that these other systems are going to require?
So a lot of it kind of boils down to the social issues as well too, but it also like just ethical implications that a company should be kind of going under. And I think you can translate that over to the food industry as well too. There's just a lot of like really kind of loopholes or things that they can slip into to get out of a big problem. I think Monsanto is probably the biggest example, just with all the amount of like chemicals and pesticides and all that type of stuff. And then them suing other farmers who aren't using their stuff all because their crop can like fly up in the air and go over to their farm over a wind gust or something like that. There becomes issues that I feel like the system, the laws that might have been set up in the 1970s, environmental, all that type of stuff, they need to kind of be adjusted in a sense too, because our environment's always changing. And I think the laws also need to change as well too. They need to be better regulated when it comes to this stuff. And you probably see a lot of answers get fixed. Now, when it comes to coal, the idea that you could make coal cleaner, not just by using scrubbers and that type of stuff. I've heard a hypothetical of adding a chemical to coal to make sure that it didn't produce as much of some type of pollutant. But I mean, yeah, pollutants everywhere that people also aren't paying attention to too. Brake lines, or not brake lines, brake pads. New York, if you take a smoker's lung who's been living in New York for 40 something years, he has brake dust coated his lungs. You got to look at all these aspects of things too, which it's really weird whenever you get into these types of discussions where someone's trying to fight the side of something. They are like a defense lawyer. They're going to defend their client, but they're not going to talk about the other things that end up getting brought up later. And that's when people start to have like, wait a minute. So you just told me all the good stuff, not all the bad stuff. It's like, yeah, why was anybody going to tell you about the things that they're not doing? They're going to tell you about all the things that they are doing. And I think this is where it comes to more of an open source of information as well out there too. If more people knew what was going on behind the backdrops when it comes to these giant corporations, and more people were more connected with the information about stuff that they feel the public doesn't need to know, you'd have a lot more people understanding and a lot more people willing to give you a little bit of time if you need time, and also willing to make change because change is needed.
Yeah, yeah, no, and the problem with, so laws are, I'm a big fan of the rule of law. Here in the United States, the laws are, despite the headlines of challenges now and again, are some of the best environmental laws in the world, and that's why where Monsanto's most misdeeds have taken place have been in developing countries, right? And so one of the obstacles to taking this knowledge and making it effective is the nation state, and the fact that there are 165 different nation states built on their own constitutions with their own sets of laws, some of which are stronger, some of which are weaker. So there's not a unified approach to this from the perspective of humanity. And I believe that's a shift that's going to take place over the next 100 years, maybe 50 years. We already see it happening at the end of the 20th century, early 21st, these international agreements about carbon dioxide, about CFCs, which was a big agreement in 1986 and kind of landmark. The idea that, we all share this earth together. And so it shouldn't be appropriate for something that everyone agrees is bad for humans in the United States to be winked and nodded at in some other place, because it's still bad for humans there as well. And that's that right now, the structure of nation states don't allow change in that arena, but a movement towards a more globalized legal system would absolutely allow for the strongest knowledge and the strongest laws to be in effect in everyone's lives. You and I breathe much cleaner air than my parents breathed growing up. You breathe cleaner air than I breathed growing up, right? It's been a steady improvement in this country, and it's you kind of can't deny that, but it hasn't been a steady improvement globally. right? Those industries moved to places where environmental laws were much more relaxed, where labor laws hardly existed at all, and they were allowed to get as much profit as they could out of those circumstances, and they took advantage of it. I mean, that was the late 20th century globalization, deindustrialization in our country, and move all these dirty industries to other places. And there wasn't a, I mean, the UN has tried to get at this, but the UN is kind of a toothless organization, and holds a lot of meetings and does a lot of studies, but doesn't have any enforcement power whatsoever. You don't want to send a military in to deal with it. So it's a wicked problem. It's a problem that we know and have measured and identified. And the structure of legal systems within nation states makes it very difficult to be able to address it as effectively as we clearly know how to do at this point.
Well, being an environmental historian as well too, has this been a topic that's always been on people's minds? Have they always been interested in the environmental protection, or is this just something of recent trends, maybe
Oh,
in
it's
the
brand
past 20?
new,
Okay.
but 50 years.
Okay.
So there was a small cadre of elites in the Western world who who launched what you might call the conservation and preservation movements in the late 19th century, early 20th century, which led to national forests. So let's set aside lands that can be used over and over and over again. That's kind of a renewable approach to timber. And let's set aside parks, these majestic areas. And I don't know if you've visited any of the US's national parks, but you must. They're beautiful, unbelievable sites that were preserved in the early 20th century for their beauty and then eventually for their ecological value. It was not until the late 1960s and the 1970s that environmentalism was even a thing. And this idea suddenly emerged in the wake of the incredible wealth from the baby boom and the economies of the 50s or the 60s, and a few really marked events. One, we got a picture of the Earth from outer space, and that's a reorienting kind of thing, and it was really a cultural shift. And then there was some massive, well publicized oil spills. Santa Barbara Beach, the Cuyahoga River here in Ohio caught fire. Now, that was the 24th time it had caught fire in the 20th century, but this time people noticed, why are rivers burning? And there was literally a cultural shift. So Earth Day 1970 was a global event. In the United States, 28 million people went out. It was the largest public protest in the history of the United States to that time. Since then, there's only been one larger event, and that was the opposition to the Gulf War in 2003. And it's preceded it by probably twice that, but we had a larger population at that point. So the largest popular protest, and then a conservative Republican president passed the laws that created the EPA and passed all of the early environmental laws, because the popular support for this was as broad and as deep and had kind of come out of nowhere. We live with the legacy of that. And so we've had 50 years of concerted attention and concern and education around this. And based on that, on the long stretch of human history, we're doing pretty well. We're not, I'd give us a B minus, I'd say. We're not failing. Absolutely not failing.
I think that's a good thing to mention, just because I feel like people, when they look at the environment and what we've done to the earth, they examine it over the whole entire period of civilization's kind of creation rather than just the last 50 years. And I always say that if you research something or if you work on something, eventually people find better ways to do it. Now, whether that better way is good just for money, or it's better ways and more effective ways to get what they want without doing more damage. And I think that needs to be prioritized more when it comes to food, when it comes to just our environment. For instance, if we're going to be off fossil fuels or do whatever type of thing, eventually you're gonna get better at it. It's kind of like when I first started, if my first episode of this show sucks, but where I'm at now, I got it more fine tuned by the 1,000th episode. So
you
it's
know
like,
what you're doing, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So
And that's
yeah.
that's what I was speaking of earlier, is that change doesn't come from on high. Change comes from people figuring out how to do things better. And we are, I think we're on a positive curve as far as that goes. I am an optimist. Now I'm alone among environmentalists because the rhetoric of environmentalism is exceptionally shrill these days. It's been tied up with the political divisiveness in this country, right? You're for the environment if you're on the left, and you're against the environment if you're on the right. That's not the longer history of environmentalism. It was very much bipartisan, and it is, scratch a Republican and you'll find out that they're conservationist and concerned about the environment too. I don't know a single individual who thinks it's not something that's important and to be concerned about. But I do know a lot of folks, particularly young folks, who kind of learned all of this stuff, been absolutely overwhelmed by it, because how are you going to stop all these big things, all these bad things that are happening, and have been hobbled to a certain extent. And that's what shifted my work to the community work that I'm doing. Was I taught environmental studies for 8 years, and I was creating a depressed bunch of undergraduates and graduates who were just like, it's too big, I don't know what to do, we need to tear down the state, we need to change the system. And I felt that was irresponsible of me, based on what I had come to learn about change, what I had seen happen in the environment, and what ultimately motivates people. Like, despair is not motivating, hope is motivating. And so creating pathways to hopeful solutions is, for me, not just about changing urban agriculture, but it's about changing the way I educate students so that they are empowered to continue on with this really significant challenge that none of us can do anything about except for in our own lives and in our own circles. And so for me, as an environmental educator, I've asked myself very seriously over the last 5 years, how do I empower students so that they don't leave college feeling like it's hopeless and what they need to do is blow up the whole system and start over again, but that they can be empowered to take the necessary steps to help contribute to this larger cultural transformation that I believe is afoot, but is not going to happen if we don't continue to work at it.
What do you think about? I know you have more of a sense of optimism probably than I do. I don't. It's not that I'm not optimistic in people. I think people are amazing, and it's awesome to be able to speak with so many of them. But I feel like we get distracted too easily, and as the person that gets distracted myself, that's a big problem in a lot of sense when it comes to things. And sadly, I also think that there's a large amount of big business out there that is able to do whatever they possibly can to make sure that it always still swings in their narrative. And I think the power's in the people for sure. I'm just curious, in the next 100 years, and as many paleontologists and people that I've spoke to about, like, just geologists in general, they are way like 2100 world's going to die. That's all their types of thinking. So I'm starting to wonder, is like, are they right? Are they wrong? What do you think the next?
I think they're absolutely wrong. I mean, I think there could be something cataclysmic, and I think this recent conflict in Ukraine raises the specter of something cataclysmic. And so something cataclysmic is the button being pushed in full-scale nuclear war, and that would be cataclysmic. I don't think the general path that we're on the other hand, is cataclysmic at all. And I think that we are slowly but surely positioning ourselves with our advanced knowledge and I mean, literally surveillance. We've got satellites around the world. We've got scientists in every ecosystem. The thing we know the least about is the ocean, but that information is coming up as well. So we're being fed information on a real-time basis at this point, and that we are remarkable and amazing and not nihilistic, that human beings have a desire to survive and not kill themselves. And I think that that's our best hope ultimately, is that, so 100 years from now, I think, this is my prediction, and I'm not supposed to predict because I'm a historian, I look backwards, but I would not be surprised if 100 years from now, people look back at this period of time and say, man, that was a period of crisis, and people thought the world was coming apart, and they thought everything was going to end, and look at where we are now. Look at what we've continued to figure out. Look at what we're up to. We're already moving towards a more stabilized population. I think that trend is going to continue. I think we'll see more. I think we'll see movement in the social components of our productive processes, such that, and this really comes from creating wealth in developing countries, but it's happening faster than it's ever happened in the history of humankind. And that empowers people to advocate for their own position, to deny exploitation in ways that still take place. And I think all of those trends are moving in a positive direction and not a negative direction. And the pessimism, I would say two things about the pessimism. It does seem like there's a strongly pessimistic tone among young people. I think that's my generation's fault for teaching the way that I taught for the first 10 years of my career, which is like, hey, guess what? Everything's screwed up and you're responsible. You go figure it out, which was irresponsible to do. Second, I think it comes from the short experiential horizon. I tell you what, the world looks a lot different in your 50s than it does in your 20s. I felt much like you do in your 20s. I had plans to pour crude oil into Exxon's fountain when the Valdez went down. I spiked trees. I wanted to change everything, and I wanted to change it yesterday because it just seemed like it could not go on the way it was. And that was really disempowering for me until I got into my graduate work and started thinking deeper. I was really flailing because, like, how do we change all of this? It all needs to change, and we can't seem to change it, and nobody seems to notice. I said some of the things you said earlier in this podcast about my sense of the general public and how complacent and how they didn't care and how they pretended and this and that. And I've come to know a whole lot more people, and I've seen a whole lot of change in the 30 years since I was your age. And that's what's given me a whole lot of hope. The fourth part of that, and I don't mean to be, I'm going to sound like I'm coming off as critical, but I think a lot of people who feel that way haven't figured out what to do. That's part of the despair. The despair isn't the culture out there. The despair is personal. Like, what do I do? What is my purpose? What is my purpose that's going to be meaningful in this space? And if you don't have your purpose figured out to be meaningful in this space, then everything's up for grabs and you can't do everything. And so you're absolutely despairing because you're trying to do too many things at once and ultimately doing nothing, in a sense. And so again, I point to my project in the community in Mansfield. I've gotten students involved in it, some of them who are now employed in it. And boy, they're living very rich lives right now in their 20s, and not wealth rich, but personally fulfilling lives where they feel like they're connected to something that's creating meaningful change in their community and for the larger food system itself. And that's the thing I would encourage to all young people is don't try to solve everything. Try to solve one thing that you can solve and make it meaningful, and you're going to find a much richer engagement with the world itself, and we'll have a better life trajectory, I think, overall.
I like that, Kip. And end it on a positive note.
Yeah, I'm an optimist. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be horribly optimistic, but I really am. I have faith that I've got kids in college right now, and they're struggling with the same questions and the same issues. But it's ultimately going to be your world in not too long a time, and that's an enormous responsibility. And we are enormously capable, and I just don't want anybody to forget that.
Optimism. I'll get there eventually, maybe the next 1,000 episodes.
Yeah.
um, Look, it'll be a pleasure to have you back on the show and talk to you more again.
Love to do it.
Where can people find you? Any of your links? Do you have a Twitter or anything like that?
Yeah, so Kip Curtis 6 on Twitter. I don't do a whole lot of Twitter. I go in once in a while and then I get depressed. I've got a couple of Facebook sites for the microfarm project. The one that's most active now is the Marion Microfarm Project. And if you just Google the microfarm project, you can learn a lot about that. My book, which is called Gambling on Ore, is available on Amazon. And I think it's a great read. It's got terrific reviews. People have really loved it. And yeah, I think that's the extent of what you can find out there, but I'm always happy to hear from folks, and always happy to try to help the pessimistic, well-meaning become optimistic and even better meaning.
Well, I appreciate you doing the show, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.